Today we're going to talk about art and wellness. My background is, prior to doing art, I was an occupational therapist. And so for years I worked in rehabilitation, and I worked with people with traumatic brain injuries. And everything I've learned in my life, I think I learned in that job. And it wasn't, and I was an occupational therapist for years, and then my family, my husband and my 4 kids, we moved out to New York. And I came from a family of creative types. My dad was actually a monk, and then he ended up being a phenomenal poet. He never really did that as a profession, but it was something that was definitely celebrated in our family. My mom is a tremendous gardener. She does beautiful things. You give her a yard, and it's amazing what she can do. One of my brothers is a writer. So I myself never went to school to study art. But when I got out to New York, there was this constant voice in my head, and it just seemed like, and I will say this a lot today, that art has always been my teacher. And it has always been these experiences in my life. And as artists, as all of us, I think our life is our art. And then we go into our studio and we start making stuff. It is a reflection of that. And it's never intended to be something to say, this is what you should think. But it's always just a way of sharing, an experience that you've created, or a thought that you've connected to, and you translate that into, whether it's a poem or it's a sculpture, or whatever that might be. So I consider myself as an artist, a generalist. I don't really think I'm great at either lane of art. I do steel sculptures. You'll see some of those. I do paintings. I do monoprints. I print. I blow glass. Whatever. Oh, I work in wood. In this project, I work at Tapestry. So what I'm interested in is connecting art to a culture or a social issue, and taking that conversation and translating into something more imaginative. And in that process, what happens for me is I end up looking around this world that surrounds me, and I tend to look at it more carefully. And whatever it is that I observe, I try to make that into something, an art form. So for me, my art it's always different than my everyday thinking. I think we all have these moments that we connect to things intuitively. For me, that's my art. So today we're going to talk about wellness and art. And this was such a great opportunity for me to look back at a lot of my work and see that thread of wellness really runs through a lot of my work. The first project that I'm going to talk about is my most recent project, and it's called Between Spaces. And this was an exhibition that was shown in Madison, Wisconsin all through the summer. And it's a real good example of how art can be used in this coordinated force of creating community change. And so the exhibition showed for 3 months, and within that showing, I brought in neuroscientists. The ballet in Madison collaborated with my writing and created a dance performance. We had a small trio of musicians that came in. We had people coming in and talking about wellness. So it was a way of doing something that art does the best. And what it does is it brings people together. And that's what that's what it's done for all of us today. So I believe that art makes a considerable contribution to the well-being of our communities. And like I said today, what's most important is that we're all together. And I hope that through this PowerPoint, I wish I had the art here to show you, and through this conversation, we can have our own conversation about this, because this exhibition was all created during the pandemic. So it's my pandemic piece. So I said a little bit about, so through art, I explore contemporary social issues and using those conversations as a way of drawing attention to various issues so that we can pay closer attention. I think that art can transform the way we think. I think it can transform the way we see, and it can transform the way we live our lives. So for me, art it's reflective, it's expressive, and it's transformative. And I think part of why art is so transformative is it has to do that experience, that moment when you're interacting with art. Whether you're creating it or you're viewing it, it's a moment To me, it reminds me of a contemplative prayer or a moment where you can connect back to yourself. So it's an invitation to connect to yourself in spite of all the chaos that we have in our lives. And we really do have a tremendous amount of chaos. So my most recent work is this pandemic project that's entitled Between Spaces. But in all honesty, the writing happened about 6 months before the pandemic. And I was grateful for that because so many of my friends, either people were really productive during the pandemic or they had nothing to do. And so for me, I got busy because I knew I had this future show. So the question, and when I start a project, it typically begins with a lot of questions. And I have this natural flow as I answer these questions, it leads me to these wonderful people whose lives have been impacted by whether it's a social or political or cultural injustice, or I connect with people who had committed their lives to solving these problems. And so this first project, or this question that I had was, what do we do when our lives fall apart, or when things fall apart? Currently our world, we're in this constant state of transition. During these unfamiliar times, disruption, unpredictability, the unusual have become our new normal, right? We are in this time of this escalating climate crisis. We have, threats, our democracy is changing in many ways. We have had this never-ending pandemic. Many of us have experienced a lot of loss during these pandemics, whether that loss was something that was the loss of a job or the loss of someone we love. Our family, in the past year, we have had 4 funerals. So we've had a lot of loss in our family. So in this new work, Between Spaces, I use poetry and I use art to tell that story. Generally, if you follow my work, I have always been somebody who connects art to activism. So my work is always about calling myself out to my blind spots or calling this world out. But this project is very different. This project, Between Spaces, is calling us all inward. And so I hope today that we can do a little bit of that. So for me, Between Spaces is a disruptive state of loss when our familiar and our formal way of living is forever changed. So again, it's a time of confusion. It's a time of loss. It's a time of uncertainty. It's a time where maybe you've gone from one stage and you're kind of in the middle of not moving on to the next stage. So it's kind of a liminal space. In the Buddhist tradition, they call it bardo. So it's just kind of the place where you haven't quite moved on and you're not sure where you're going. This could be, it could be a medical condition. It could be a retirement. It could be a new job. It could be having a baby. We have all of these times in our lives, these transitions. They aren't unusual. Some of them are voluntary, some are involuntary. But I want you to know that this is going to be a positive art talk. Because I do believe that in these times of uncertainty, we can see new possibilities. In these spaces that seem somewhat empty, we can reach beyond what's there and we can have new possibilities. I don't begin to think I have all the answers, but what I'd like to do is to share with you about my disrupted time and what were the pieces that helped me walk through it. And for me, those pieces were art, self-reflection, nature, and community. So this is a picture of me, and I put this in there because it's kind of a joke because I can talk about art all day, and I swear I won't. But this is what I love doing, is talking about art and why art's important and why art makes a difference and how art can transform our lives. And so you're going to hear me doing a lot of that kind of talking, and I can't help myself. It's just, it is my teacher. So this is the Between Space exhibition. This is only a part of it, but I wanted you just to kind of see the overall vibe of what this is. The first part about this project was, so sometimes I always write with my artwork. Sometimes the writing comes first, And then the writing helps me step inside of the art, the sculpture and all that. Other times I make the art and then the writing comes second. But what I'd like to do today is I'd like to read a little bit of this poetry book, which I've given you all one, and you're welcome to take these home. It's called Exhibitions Swag, I guess. And it's a chat book. So poets, often, if we aren't fortunate to get published, which is a hard thing to do as a poet, we create these chat books, and this is the chat book. I'm not going to read the whole thing because you have it, but I would like to read a little bit of it to kind of create a space, a holding space for us to think about this. So, writing magnifies life and my way of living. Looking backwards, page after page, revealed by many over and done renderings. A collection of past, my many words and phrases. I pinned them onto my studio's empty wall. Word by word, I began to write. My purest of all moment, pure. Again and again, my before moments became my after, merging into new ways of being, new revisions and combinations never seen. Leaving behind my tried and true, I searched for something new. New thinking, new seeing, opening myself to being wrong felt right. I surrendered to my tangled conceit and I let go. In life, interruptions are invitations not fully received or revealed. I lost myself. I seemed to be someplace in between. I paused and I gently moved within me and beyond me in pursuit of something. I tried being less of that highly edited version of me, less of that thundering, self-promoting kind of she. My outer boundaries were stiffened, hardened, and weary, and the further I wandered from that moment, the more diminutive it all seemed. Each dawn I am summoned from my dreams, each sacred morning an ordination. My connection to spirit at my tiny little altar behind my small, windowing, blue-gray moon. I sit and I empty my thoughts onto the morning dark. In this wordless silence, I wait and I become available to a familiar presence. My truest of all moments true. This is where I belong. A mystery beyond imagining, an invitation to be more, to see more, and I move inward. Many years ago, when I was tiny, all freckled and aglow, I delighted in life's billowing, and I trusted in ways not fully received. And like an airy presence, like parted and free, I knew when to surrender and I knew when to go. When I was just a girl, I carried away knowing and wanting to be. And like a twirling invitation, I captured life's essence. And I lived without boundaries, giving reverence to a presence that honored my presence in this world. And like a familiar voice and unspeakable joy, I knew where to follow and I knew where to go. I am a steel blue jewel, not to be scored. I am a spirit that recognizes spirit, trusting moments that I see rather than moments that I see that I am. I miss my sacred ones, the ones of me and from me, those who inherit my heart, and reveal that love can be within and beyond. And with gentle kisses and sweet scented goodbyes, my sacred ones tail the soul of the wind, and I move beyond because it is their time. My words walk with me into each painting. This is where I want to be. The mystery of an animal moves beyond the animal. And I'm just moving around. In closing, withdrawing into this quiet silence made me feel again and again, beyond the regular. I became all that is, imagining something beyond what I am. And by receding, I expanded and I moved ever so slightly. And I finally accepted being accepted, allowing myself to belong to myself in the randomness of me. By wandering into unfamiliar spaces, I lost myself and I expanded beyond what I knew and beyond what I could see, and I received. So this is just part of a poem and you're welcome to take it home. But it kind of sets the whole exhibition up in a way. So the poem came first and the writing came first, and it helped me, as I mentioned in the poem, step inside of the art. I think that vulnerability is really important to expansion. And initially when I started this project, I was super quiet about it because I felt like, gosh, I'm in this lost space. And let me back up a little bit and talk about this. I'm a planner, I'm obsessive. Like, I have 15 years of projects ahead of me all the time. I know where I'm going, I know where I'm moving. I usually multitask and I have 4 projects moving until abruptly when this problem started, it really wasn't a problem, but when I had this moment of in-between space and loss, I had none. I had no project. And it was interesting because what I would usually do is my usual thing would be just start, moving other exhibitions up and doing more facilitations and things like that. And I have this wonderful husband, and he was like, you need to just pause. He goes, you need to slow down. He goes, and just be in the space of unfamiliar loss and where you're not understanding what your next project is. And to be honest, it was a horribly uncomfortable place to be because I like to keep moving. I begin every morning at 4 a.m. It's a curse to some people, I know, but to me, it's beautiful. I love the morning. It is a very contemplative time for me. I write. I'm getting my master's in divinity, so I love all the religious traditions. I like reading about that stuff. It's something that has been a real part of my life. Years and years ago, 30 years ago, I read that Dr. Martin Luther King would get up and have like these 3 and 4 hour sessions. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's such a busy guy. If he can do that, I can get up for an hour. So it's not that I'm this holy roller and I do this. I don't want you to think that at all. My life desperately needs that grounding. And so during this time of vacancy and no project, artists always have to have source material. The source material is what inspires us. It's what keeps us moving through our project. And at this point, I had no source material. I did not have a project. So what I did is I went back through all of those handouts and all of that writing, thousands and thousands of pages. And I started looking at that material again. And as I looked through it, I started capturing intuitively things in there that seemed to connect one way or another. And as I mentioned in the poem, My Empty Walls, I started pinning those words and phrases on there. And then that is the material that became the poetry. So looking backwards, allowed me to move forward. So then I began writing and I began making art. So I want to talk a little bit about, you can see these, some of the wood pieces. I love working with wood. Many artists, you don't have to make all your art. I used to think, I have to make everything. This I didn't touch, and it's so beautiful in its own way. I found this in a barn, and it's a beautiful example of seeing beauty in the wounds, in all of our wounds. And this is an old piece, and if you know about wood, it's all buckling and twisting because it was a diseased trunk. And I just thought it was a stunning sculpture. And again, nature.
It's really cool.
Isn't that amazing? Can you believe that? So I want to talk about wood because I do carve. I love carving wood. So the question, I said there's all these questions to this. So the question I was trying to answer was how do we reorient ourselves when we find ourselves in this unfamiliar quiet, which is where I found myself. So wood carving creates a softening. It creates an empty space. So when these wood chunks get dropped off at my house, they're 150 pounds. They're huge pieces of wood. They've been, if I'm lucky, they've been dried in kiln. So they're a little lighter than they would be. The process of carving only suggests the final form. And here's what I mean by that. When you're working with wood, you're constantly having to adapt. You know, carving is about adaptability. If I'm working with a piece of steel, I cut it, I measure it, I get my welding gear on, and I zap it, you know? It's bing, bing, bing. Working with wood is so different because wood is this material that had a life before me. You know, it had a life. And you can see that when you see the rings. And I got a close-up. So you can kind of see that this block of wood had a history. These many rings and these visible signs of expansion in some ways and restrictions in other ways. To me, this is a lot like people. It's like life, you know, that there are times in our lives when our lives are strained, and there are times in our lives where our lives just kind of are in this flow. So I had to carefully carve through that history as I worked on this piece of wood. And in the show, there's about 4 or 5 different pieces of wood. I had to work around the wounds, the scars, the decay, you know, between spaces that really needed my grace, not my control. And I think that this is a really good reminder, again, art being our teacher, is that when we are going through these moments of crisis and commotion and these unfamiliar quiet times when we're not certain, you know, it's important to be graceful to ourselves and to soften ourselves. And that's what this reminds me of, is that as I started, a quick story going through, I had probably 30 hours on one of these pieces, and I get in the middle of this piece, and all of a sudden it's just this mess of chalk. And then I find this little carcass, which was a little worm that was dead, that had somehow made that its home. And so that's what I'm talking about. That little worm had gotten itself in this wood piece and made it its home, and I got in there and I had to adjust and I had to adapt and I had to work around that piece with lots of grace. So sometimes, and one of the things I think I learned through these disruptive times is I learned that, you know, sometimes losing something or a loss or a surprise, or if you want to call it, in that case, a mistake. I mean, I wasn't expecting that. It ended up being an opportunity. An opportunity because I modified my design on that wood piece, and it ended up looking much more beautiful. And so I was grateful for that. If you have any questions at any time, you guys, we can talk. So fabric drawings and monoprints. So these are large prints. There was about 30 of them in the show, and I created these during the pandemic in my studio basement with very few materials, because like most of us, we didn't have a lot of materials, a lot of equipment, so we kind of had to use what we had. So between spaces are places where our life loses its form. During these times of formlessness, sometimes what we try to do is we try to cling to what's familiar. And I think it's really important that we don't do that, because by clinging to what's familiar, to clinging to the cultural, the social sort of expectations, clinging to those old stories about ourselves, only create comparisons. And we start comparing everything about what we did before to what we're doing now, to who we were. And I think it's much better to just come to things with such a sense of openness. And so as you see this work, and I'll flip through it, it's all about expansion. It's all about formlessness, you know, and it's all about composure. I was very careful about the colors that I selected. I remember sitting in angsty times during the pandemic and just looking at these paintings, and they just calmed me down. And everything about this show centered around that. And when I get to the glass pieces, I'll kind of go into that a little bit better. Like all of you, most of the materials that were needed to create the fabric drawings I'm going to show you in the monoprints, they were somewhat unfamiliar to me. I felt like, hey, if I'm going to talk about uncertainty, I need to walk the walk. So I don't sew. I wish I did. But you'll see some tapestries and some pieces that I ended up working on. These big pieces were made with big screens. And if you're familiar with how t-shirts are made, you pull your paint through screens where you've blocked off some areas. It's a really fun process, but it's a pretty precise process. And my screens, I had to use the same screens because I couldn't go to the university and clean them up because it was closed. So I would go in the middle of the winter and try to clean these screens at car washes and places like that. And the screens would just rip. And I couldn't keep ripping my screens, so I decided I'm just gonna have to use what I have. And what that did is having less was more. Again, it pushed me to be more creative. So let's look at a few of these. So it's all about layering. There's nothing difficult about this. It is a bit about precision. And here are the tapestries. So the tapestries are huge. And again, I've never worked with tapestries, but again, it's the same idea. You're starting to see like expansion. You're seeing that in the trees, the wood pieces and everything. The funny story about this is my 85-year-old mom and I did this together. And she is super amazing and very strong because we took just pounds and pounds of fabric and we wanted to use natural dyes. And if you know anything about botanical dyes are things like flowers and their roots and their leaves. And when you dye with these materials, you don't have a lot of control. At least I didn't. Maybe somebody was really good at it. But so we would make these beautiful natural colors. And the beautiful thing about them is if you use synthetic dyes, you cannot get those colors because these colors are from nature. And so that was really important to me that we kind of had this openness about how these came about. And then after we hung them in my basement and let them drip and dry all over everything. Again, it was the middle of winter. Then the designs were created, and then I sewed them all up on these big sewing machines. And I didn't really like the colors. The colors were beautiful, but they didn't complement the rest of the show. So I ended up putting lots of bleach foam on them and just kind of wait for it. And the thing, and again, I think that's a really good message, is sometimes you just have to be fearless about things. And you can't be so concerned about outcomes. And I knew that by doing this process, I was either going to screw this up entirely or it was going to work. And I think it worked out really nice because they ended up tying in with the wood pieces. So the last piece of art I want to talk about in the show is these are Karens. I don't know if you've probably seen Karens before and not even known that they were called Karens. But Karens are pre-assembled rock structures where you'll see them all over the world on trailheads. And what they're meant to do is when you're hiking or you're on a walk and maybe the pathway isn't very clear, somebody who has walked that path before you is there to assist you by creating this pile of rocks. And it's an indication for you as the walker to know that this is the way to go. And so for me, this connects me to the fact that during these in-between and difficult times, we need to connect to each other. And we need to connect to people that we love and people we trust because they can help us find our way when we're in these between lost spaces. So these pieces were actually blown glass. And so they were blown very thick, and there were, I think, 50 of them in the show. And I assembled them on top of each other to represent that whole idea of staying connected with people. After they were finished, I sandblasted them because I wanted them to be soft, because I wanted everything in the show to have this softness. And so when I finish the show, and I think that's all I'm going to talk about with the show, and if you have any questions, I have a lot of other shows that we can talk about on wellness. But I think that this is a good show talking about personal wellness and how do we take care of ourselves during these difficult times, because they're inevitable and they're always going to be coming. And again, I think the things that I learned were that, to feel complete in your incompleteness. I couldn't figure out what I wanted to say, but I think that was a real important thing for me to learn, to be complete in my incompleteness, and to be okay with formlessness, and that in that formlessness, try to relax and trust that something is going to come your way and it's going to be fine. I learned that less is more often. I think that we all learn to think about what was really important to us in our lives during this time. I also learned that, connecting with others, connecting with myself, self-reflection, that was really important. Being nature, that was important. And then the thing that I really learned that if I can't do any of that is just to pause and then to just slow down. So that is the Between Spaces exhibition. Does anybody have any questions? After I do this, I'm going to move on to a project that I think, whereas this is personal well-being, the next project is community well-being. And I don't think you can have community well-being without having personal well-being, because we're all interconnected. So I'm kind of working backwards. So prior to Between Spaces, in 2017, I did a project. It was called Women Against Hate United by Love. And I have a video here. This project showed, honestly, I think 20 times between 17 and the pandemic. It just popped up all over the state, at conferences. And let's just listen. And if you can't hear this, I'm going to talk about it afterwards, but let's see if we can get it done.
Hello, Milwaukee. My name is Kelly Parks Snider. I'm a Wisconsin artist and activist, and I'm one of the co-founders of Women Against Hate United by Love. Today is a celebration of women as we build power, community, and courage. Women Against Hate United by Love is a traveling art exhibition that works in a coordinated effort with artists and activists throughout the state of Wisconsin, pushing back against intolerance, bigotry, racism, and hatred. We are the collective of women protectors. We are mothers, we are sisters, we are daughters, we are grandmothers. We are women of color, we are trans women, we are white women, we are indigenous women, we are women with disabilities, we are women who have been incarcerated, we are women who do sex work, we are refugee women. We came together as a response. We have seen hate throughout history, the kind of hate that justifies hate towards different communities based on their race. We've also seen the kind of hate that allows violence towards women in non-conforming groups. What's really important is that this exhibition offers a platform and heightens the visibility of great women whose voices are rarely heard. The stories about their communities and about their lives and their families are misrepresented. The tension that art and activism brings is very important. It causes you to pause and to look with a greater sense of honesty. And we can look at these injustices and we can connect them back to ourselves, which is where change has to start. I think what's difficult for people to do is how to show up. And I feel that we all feel as though we have to understand each other before we show up. And there's no time for that. The women are coming. We've always been here, but it's now our time. Creating change is always a story about many people working together. And it is an honor to introduce you to a star who is one of our founding mothers. That's what we call ourselves. Here's to you, a star.
That was a really, I love that project. It connected me to so many incredible women throughout the state. Women who I'd worked with off and on various projects. But I think what's important about this is the idea of showing up. And I'd love to talk about that because everybody gets really confusing. I've been working in racial inclusion and diversity issues for over 20 years. And so during that time, there's been a lot of different changes and different ways that I've had an opportunity to do that or not, or step back, whatever. But this project was just a response because it seemed like there was this heightened hatred towards various people in our communities. And so the idea was, it's hard to understand something you haven't experienced, right? And so I felt like that story needs to be told by people whose life have been impacted by this, whose family have been impacted by this, and people who are out there making a difference with their work. Because I knew that the answers to issues and problems should be answered by people who actually have had the experience and understand the issues. So this is such an amazing project because it connected 30 women throughout the state. Many of the women never knew each other, but they did through this project because we connected together and worked on each other's priorities. And the idea of showing up is important because sometimes we don't know, like, how do I show up? And for me, I think this is a really good example of how you can show up. You cannot understand things you haven't experienced. And I can't say that loud enough. But what you can do is you can show up with humility, and you can listen, and then you can become engaged in the issue. And for me, when I would call many of the women who I highlighted, I would sit with them and they'd say, well, Kelly, what is your project about? And I would say, I don't know. That's why I'm here, to talk to you. And the moment they heard that, they knew I wasn't some voyager who's coming in trying to solve problems that I don't know about. And so the whole project ended up being this fantastic way of how art can be used in a coordinated force, as a campaign, as an initiative to create change. Because every place this show showed up, or popped up, or whatever gallery, 2 or 3 women who were faces were being highlighted. They came in and they talked. And so, as I mentioned at the very beginning, art brings people together. Art creates a conversation in a way that isn't preachy, is not didactic, telling people what to think, but it brings people together so we can have these difficult conversations. And so that's what happened with that project. And then, boom, the pandemic and everything slowed down. But it's a wonderful project. All the work was done in printmaking. And I did that with Rachel Griffin and Lee Garcia, who are 2 phenomenal printmakers from Tandem, or not from Tandem, one of them was at Tandem, but from Madison. And we got together, these 2 young women and I, 2 to 3 times a week for almost a year to make all that work. Wow. And yeah, so it was a project that I'll never forget. And all the women, we would get together occasionally and have dinners together and just kind of got to know each other. So anyway, that's a project of how art can be used in a way of creating community well-being. So Hidden in Plain Sight was an exhibition that started for me in creating it in 2010, and it started showing in 2012. Okay, so this was a long time ago. And what I love about it is because art helps us ask questions about the world that surrounds us. Art can create tension. And sometimes we need tension in order to pay attention. And so in many ways, we have become such bystanders, just taking in such vast amounts of commercial generated advertising and things like that we stop thinking, and so much advertising and media is just completely filled with stereotypes and generalizations. And I think it's a real problem. And so this exhibition is about getting engaged and really looking for these various injustices that are hidden in plain sight. It's sort of a joke on that word, hidden in plain sight. They're right in front of us. But the problem is if we don't call wrongdoing out, we end up normalizing it. And so this is a big steel ball that I created with my son, Mitch. So these lines and barriers and blockades, They represent a lot of the injustices that many of us face. Deeply seated in history, we've had so many injustices, especially racial injustices. And so this exhibition looks at power, privilege, and inequality. And it attempts to kind of, it's a huge show. I mean, there's so many different parts to it. There was a little book that came out of it, a lot of different things. So I tried to just pick a few items. And so I think this was just the overall showing all the lines, the limitations. And I always ask people, are you the kind of person that got to stand in the front of the line? Or did you stand in the back of the line? And lines are used to this whole thing. Does anyone a family member, have to sneak over a borderline? I mean, there's just this whole project ends up being almost a workshop. So one of the things this is a huge piece of art. I'm sorry, I got sun in my eyes. Again, this was in 2010. So this is looking at gerrymandering, which we've heard a lot about political gerrymandering, especially now we're learning about that a lot more. And so these 3 panels, I hired a cartographer. And what I was interested in is I wanted to see how these congressional district, these lines that are, and I mean, this is its own hour talk in itself, but I think this is a really wonderful way of looking at art and using art as an experience to understand a really complicated issue, such as gerrymandering. And what I was interested in is it's interested in the minority vote and how did these lines dilute their power. And then in the yellow, what do you think the yellow dots are? They're prisons. They're state and federal prisons. And I was interested in those lines. And prison gerrymandering is a really interesting and very unjust thing. So people who are incarcerated are moved from their community and they're put into these correctional institutions, which are primarily in rural communities. And because we disproportionately, we imprison people of color in those communities, those urban communities, the prison population is counted in that rural community, yet they are not able to vote. And so, again, art creating questions about, is that fair? What about the justice of that? So for me, this was what this piece was about. This is a really great piece that, this looks at advertising in women. I told you I was kind of obsessive. Well, this is one of the things I'm obsessed about. So this is a panel, one of 3 panels. This is a 30-foot panel. There's a second. Here's part of the second. And here's the third. Thank you. So what I was interested in finding out is, again, there's a brown line. This whole show is complete with lines. So underneath the brown line are the victories, the struggles, the commitments, the real lives of women, starting at the turn of the century, moving to contemporary day. Up above is all of the tricks and lies and misrepresentation that the advertisers were using to try to tell a different story about women. And what's interesting, and I've been studying and talking about media literacy for 15 years, but what was so interesting is just to see that when that line becomes blurred, we stop seeing what is real and what is true. And it's sad to say this, but in many ways, I think that's where we are. And so it's really important to teach young people, particularly about media literacy, and all of us. And Anne-Marie had mentioned Project Girl, which is a program that Jane Bartel and I started, it was, I don't even know, 2006, I think. And it was a program that scaled out nationally. It was art-based, using art, media literacy, and youth-led activism into a program helping young people become more critical interpreters of media and advertising. And it's a project that still goes on. I received a lot of funding for that project, so we have free resources on the website. We have curriculum for teachers and all kinds of things. But it's a really neat, I'll just show you a little bit. So this is called Commercial Land, right? And this is this triptych, and it acts as a monologue talking about the things that I felt as a young person, the lies and tricks that advertisers were using to sell me products. And they weren't just selling me products, they were trying to make me feel bad about myself so that I felt as if the only way to be happy was to buy whatever it was they were selling. And so this every single item on that has a story. And I use this actual project, I do it with kids. I've done it with kids all over the country. And this exhibition has traveled to probably 15 states. And it's just a really good way of working with kids because it doesn't preach at kids. It's experiential, art. It takes kids where they're at. And the most important thing is that at the end of these Project Girl, which I do with boys too, because boys are just as affected by this as girls, there's an art exhibition, and it's a youth exhibition. And so then the young people stand up and they talk about this stuff better than I can talk about it. And it ends up being this ability for young people to be the reformers of their communities and their schools. One of the things I encourage young people to do is to go to everybody, not just young people, all of us, to go to a thinking space or a creative space. The place where you disconnect from all of that. And then this was one piece where we did, this is Nepali paper, and we created these. It looks really fancy, but they're just paper mache bodies, And the whole idea is that we never see bodies that look like real people in the media and in advertising. They're always bodies that have been photoshopped. So we just create a lot of conversations. This is a project that's called Rural Women Voice and Spirit, and I think I'll end here, but I'm going to read a poem. Her name is Judy Douglas, and in this project, Jane Bartell and I connected with probably 20 farm women, and this was done in 15, 20 years ago, I think. And the idea was to connect urban people to rural people, and this whole idea of our well-being, of our food. Where does our food come from? How is it being produced? How is it grown? And Judy Douglas was a woman who lives near Broadhead, and she was a journalist. She'd gone to Northwestern University, got her degree in journalism, and fell in love with a farmer. And they lost their farm. When many people were losing their farms, they lost their farm. And so I went down there, and she was such an amazing person, and we did a lot of interviewing, and we brought video cameras. And then one day she asked me to come back, and she said, will you come back, just you? And I came back, and she had this drawer full of poems. And we sat there all afternoon, and she read these poems. It just blew my mind. And so in closing, I feel like this is a good one because we're here at the end of summer. Autumn greening. Frost settled over grassy marsh and river bottoms 3 nights ago, right on schedule, but too early as usual. It brought the blazing trees of autumn and emerald greens of grass revived by August rains. Most glorious of all, it forced the flowers of summer to one last curtain call. They danced on stage in finery never seen before, glorious in color, spectacular in design, and breathtaking in abundance. It is as if their whole existence was directed to this precious distilling moments in the brilliant light of October stage. How like those flowers I would like to be, after first frost, having glimpsed the season's ending, summing up with color and grace and abundance, showing the world what I had finally become. Thank you. Thank you, guys.